One thing we learn when we run these kinds of events is flexibility. Our next speaker, unfortunately, our scheduled next speaker took ill. That was Natasha Herzig at Microsoft. And so has not been able to join us today, but fortunately for us, Kelly Jones has volunteered to step in and join us. So it is my pleasure to introduce Kelly. She is the head of Global Thought Leadership at Microsoft Advertising. Please welcome her.
Thank you. So I'm going to do my best to channel Natasha for all of you today. I've worked with her for about 2 years. We work together very closely. I lead our thought leadership program under her. So the only difference is I'm going to try not to talk as fast as she does, for those of you who have met her before. So ultimately, what I'm going to talk to you about, when Natasha started about, I may not be able to get this clicker to work. There we go. So when Natasha came to Microsoft 2 years ago, we met initially, and at the time, I've been at Microsoft for 7 years. At the time, I was working with some pretty traditional media research. And she approached me and asked me if I'd like to come work for her. And she said, look, we want to do something really different here at Microsoft. And she has a CPG background, and I think traditional CPG product researchers have an incredibly close relationship with consumers. They really understand consumer need states. Technology companies are a little bit different. I think Steve Jobs famously said that he didn't need consumers to tell him what he wanted. He would tell them what they wanted, which, you know, it's traditionally a supply-driven business, not a demand-driven business. But at Microsoft, we're starting to shift a little bit. And that's because the world that we live in has really changed significantly. So Natasha approached me and she said, let's figure out a different way to do consumer insights here at Microsoft. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that point of view or philosophy today. And then I'll give you an example of how we're doing it. We did a study about 2 years ago. So I'll take you through that study at a very high level. We continue to iterate on these studies all the time. So we have some additional research that we're doing related to that. So I'll give you a little sneak preview of that. And then we'll finish up by having a quick discussion on measurement and KPIs. I'm not going to solve any big problems here just to set expectations, but certainly what I'm going to discuss prior to that will have huge ramifications for how we measure in the future. Okay, so we all remember this. When the internet started, most of us had a computer in a room. We had to go to that room to get online. And believe it or not, remember we couldn't use a telephone and get on the internet at the same time. I remember getting on the internet and my dad would pick up the phone and start yelling because he would hear that static. So quite a different world back then. And this is where we are today. Maybe we're not as far as we think we are. There we go. So this is now. So we have this family. The computer is no longer in a room, right? So we can get online anytime, anywhere, from any place. And we're doing it from different devices, a lot of times at the same time. So this family's probably sitting there. They're together. They're also sort of alone with their device. And they're probably watching television while they're gaming or checking email or shopping and texting with friends potentially. So a very different world that we live in. And what this means is that we actually have to develop consumer insights in a different way. So we do quite a bit of consumer journey work at Microsoft to uncover sort of all the different influences, both media but also word of mouth. We just saw a great social presentation, also word of mouth and all the different influencers that come in and affect how people make decisions. And obviously, we have a stake in that game as Microsoft because we hope to provide some of that connective tissue that enables consumers to sort of travel along their journey in a seamless way and bring marketers closer to them at the right moments in their decision-making process. But as we do this, we used to talk about the traditional sales funnel and the fact that consumers were sort of falling through this funnel. That was a marketer funnel. And it was useful for marketers because it gave us a discourse, a common language to talk about upper funnel behavior, lower funnel behavior. But the truth of the matter is that's not how consumers are making decisions. And in fact, they're not in our funnel, we're in theirs. So we're trying to kind of flip this over and look at it from the consumer perspective. It isn't about our primetime marketing spot, it's about the consumer's moment. It's very much a one-to-one moment. And we need to understand more not only about what consumers are doing, but even more importantly, why they're doing it. Because it's when we unearth that why the behavior behind the motivation, that we can really start to develop messages that correspond to the mind state of the consumer in any given time. So in short, what Natasha and I talked about that day and what we've been working to do is not just stop at the behavior. And we all are very familiar with this, and it still has a huge role in media planning. We still have to do it to a certain extent. But we don't just want to know what consumers are doing. This consumer goes to MSN, and then she does a search on Bing, and then she goes here. We want to know why she's doing it. And that's what we keep, so as soon as we kind of get to the behavior, we keep going in any given research piece. And this typically involves triangulating a couple different qualitative methodologies and then validating all of that through a quantitative survey. I'm going to give you an example. Some of you might be familiar with this research. It was done about 2 years ago. It debuted at Cannes. And it was all about how consumers were interacting with devices. So I often get the question from customers, Kelly, can I just, and not so much anymore, but certainly 2 years ago, can I just take my television ad and just put it everywhere? I know consumers are everywhere, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to plaster that ad everywhere I can think of. And intuitively, that just didn't seem quite right, but we never really had a study to prove it. So we did a huge study with qualitative and quantitative off the back of it that corresponded or asked consumers to kind of attach an archetype for each screen. And when we did this, when we got the results back, we were pleasantly surprised to find that this actually held across 5 different markets, so it was fairly universal. And in addition to this, we're continuing to, we're midstream on another research piece where we're continuing to ask this question to see if it's evolved. It actually has not evolved with the exception of the tablet, which has changed a little bit in the past 2 years. But ultimately, this research has helped us not only understand what consumers are doing on each device, but what that deeper motivation is behind why they're doing it, and certainly kind of the need state behind the behavior, which helps marketers understand, okay, I might have the same marketing campaign, but I'm going to do it differently for the lover, much more intimate, much more personal, much less interruptive, than I am on television, which is more about the everyman. And I'll just take you through this in a little bit more detail. This is a pretty straightforward example. So when we look at the television came through as the everyman archetype, so kind of think of it like the Homer Simpson in your living room. It's not somebody you have to dress up for. Pretty relaxing, pretty straightforward. This is all about entertainment. So it's actually about passive entertainment. Now the gaming console is not too dissimilar. Keep in mind a lot of people are starting to stream movies and stream entertainment from here, but it tends to be a little bit more active in the way that consumers are using it. The tablet used to be the magician. 2 years ago, people thought it was sort of this magical device. Nowadays, we're a little bit more used to it, so it's really a pleasure-seeking device with the explorer archetype, so a place where you can discover new things. The Sage, the computer, it's always been sort of our encyclopedia replacement, so to speak. It's all about information seeking. And finally, the mobile phone, probably the most popular insight that we still have CMOs running around referencing. The mobile phone is the lover, and it's all about communication and closeness. So those are the behaviors, but what about the specific needs that are revealed within each of these relationships? Well, for the television, we know this is about more passive entertainment. And when we spoke to consumers, we found that time and time again, that this really is about comfort and relaxation. When we look at the gaming console, again, also entertainment, a bit more active. We found that the underlying need state here was fun and also achievement. There's that kind of sense for consumers that they want to get to the next level of their game and feel really good about themselves, feel very accomplished. And then for the Explorer, we said that was a pleasure-seeking device, less about work, more about entertainment and pleasure. And consumers so far are really responding to sort of more of a discovery need state and exploration, which is very much a human need and a human desire. And then the Sage, which is what the laptop or computer is, information seeking. This is about depth and learning. And finally, the Lover, we just talked about how it's still primarily a communication device, even though we might not be making calls necessarily. We're still emailing and checking in on social networks. We found for consumers the underlying need state here is about belonging and connection. Now, all this said, the new piece of research that we're conducting off the back of this, we acknowledge that consumers aren't using these screens in isolation, right? How many people use more than one screen at a time? Probably a lot of us. So what happens when you have these archetypes and they metaphorically walk into a bar and start interacting with each other? Well, that's what our new piece of research is all about. It's all about multi-screening. So how are consumers using more than one screen at a time? And what is the motivation behind these behavioral patterns? Because that motivation can help marketers understand how they need to kind of take consumers through these experiences and meet them, again, in their moment within that so-called purchase funnel. So far, and this research, by the way, is coming out in March, so we're done with a couple markets, but we still have a few more to go. But so far, we've uncovered 3 dominant patterns for multi-screening. The first one is sequential, so this is really when you have the same journey across screens. So you might start on your mobile phone, maybe you take a picture of a concert poster in the subway, and to remind you, oh, that looks like a really fun concert, and then later on you go back to your computer and you actually buy the concert ticket after you remind yourself by looking at that photograph. The second is simultaneous, so this is the same journey across different devices at the same time. So probably the most common, I think Nielsen said that 30% of consumers of tablet usage actually happens simultaneously while consumers are watching television. So imagine you're watching the 49ers game, and you might want to check in with your social media feed on your tablet while you're watching that game. All of a sudden it becomes a sort of shared experience rather than a more isolated experience. And then finally, the last pattern that we saw was we categorized as separate. So this is really a multitasking or almost a distraction type behavior where consumers are undergoing different journeys at the same time on multiple screens. So imagine that you're playing, maybe you're playing a game, you're playing Xbox, and you're also texting your friend on your mobile phone about your plans later on that night. So it's sort of that busy finger activity where we're always grabbing a phone, we're always grabbing our tablet, whatever the case may be, because we're just constantly sort of feeling like we need to be active on these devices. Now, as we are digging further into these patterns, we're finding that they all have very different intent or motivations behind them, and consequently should have different measurement and KPIs as well. So for sequential, it's very intent-based. Sequential is all about getting something done. As a marketer, you want to move the consumer to the device that's probably best suited for that action. So if it's buying something in a transactional environment, it's probably the PC. So how can you get them from one device to another in order to get them to accomplish whatever that goal is? For simultaneous, we found 2 different behaviors in this particular pattern. The first one is a connecting and sharing behavior. So that example I gave about watching the 49ers game, and then you get on your Twitter feed and you check Facebook, that connecting and sharing behavior is one. And the second is more of a behind-the-scenes behavior. So perhaps you are watching your favorite television show, and you want to see some deleted scenes on YouTube at the same time, or you want to look up information about a specific actor. So it's related to what your kind of primary screen activity is, but it's giving you kind of some supplementary extra information behind it. And then finally, separate. Multitasking, I'm still not sure we have quite the right term there, because multitasking sort of implies that this is productive behavior, but what we're finding in the research is it's not necessarily about being productive and getting things done. It's more about distraction. It's more about, I have 2 seconds. Let me grab my phone and see what I can play with for those 2 seconds. So really interesting consumer behavior that we're trying to get to the bottom of there. And we have fancy names for these. So for sequential, we call that quantum journey, because they're sort of leaping across space and time from one screen to the other to accomplish something. For simultaneous, we call this spider webbing behavior, because that kernel of content, which 15 years ago would have been the main show, ceases to become nearly as important as all the threads that are emanating out. And those threads could be social threads. Those threads could also be supplementary content, user-generated content in many cases as well. And finally, not to be insulting to the human race, but multitasking, we all have become munching cows. We're constantly grazing on technology. We're constantly grazing on media content. So I think for for measurement and how we actually approach this, if we are focused on the need state underlying the behavior, there's a very different ramification for how we would measure that. So imagine in that example I just showed you, the way that you would actually measure consumer engagement in a multitasking or grazing scenario would be very different from a spiderwebbing scenario. Dwell time might be very important for spiderwebbing because we want to see if we can kind of get that stickiness from that original content through all of those different related threads. But content grazing, it's really not about spending that much time. It's about distraction. It's about playing a quick game when you have a minute. It's about texting a friend or emailing somebody really quickly. Dwell time's not going to work there as an effective measurement metric. So we feel like there's still a lot of thought that needs to be put up against this. And I will say that while we haven't had any grandiose revelations about this yet, I spend about 15% of my time with Microsoft engineers. This is very new. I would say 2 years ago, engineers were not interested in anything that I had to say about consumer insights or what I've been learning from consumers. That's really shifting at Microsoft. So we do have people who are much smarter than I am who are asking about how consumers are using devices, what are the opportunities, what should we be building to help consumers have a smoother journey, what should we be building to help marketers get closer to consumers throughout that, and most importantly of all, how can we actually measure what's working and what's not? So it is something that our teams back in Seattle and Redmond are thinking quite a bit about. So that's just a quick sneak peek at an upcoming piece of research that we have coming out, sort of the philosophy behind it. If you have any questions, I think I have a couple minutes now, and you're welcome to email me, and I'll always get in touch with Natasha as well. Any questions? Yes?
How does the advent of the Microsoft Surface change that thought process of how to measure and how to look at the behavior of the devices?
Yeah, it's interesting because the tablet, when we first started that archetype study, the tablet came through, like I said, as the magician. Sort of, people didn't really quite know what it was or what need it was fulfilling. But now it's really evolved into that explorer. It's about discovery and experience. The tablet, the Surface tablet, is a little bit different from the iPad in the sense that, it was built to be kind of a hybrid that should enable productivity as well as that sort of more pleasure-seeking kind of behavior. So we did a very small qualitative study on a couple consumers because when we did this research, the Surface was just coming out. And it kind of came through as the creator, which is somewhere in between the Sage, which is more productive in the laptop, and that sort of pleasure-seeking discovery device. So we'll do more research around it as it kind of gains in adoption. I love mine, by the way. Yeah.
Hi, I had a question about your the traditional sales funnel and how you guys are sort of rethinking that. So could you just sort of give some highlights about how that's different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so we have a couple of different studies that we've worked with Ipsos OTX on. And we usually go pretty deep into different verticals, but it's actually revealed to be a 5-stage process. And consumers don't move through it, as we all probably know, in a linear manner anymore. So what we do is we take a group of consumers and we freeze them at any of those 5 stages, which is everything from the sort of, we call it, it's like a pre-trigger phase. It's before they become aware that they have a need, and yet they are starting to notice whatever it is that they want to buy, whether it's a new car or a new shampoo. We call it selective perception. They're starting to notice it in the world even before the light bulb comes on and they decide that they need to build a consideration set. So everything from that very, very first stage all the way through to the experiencing stage, which is well post-purchase, when they're seeking not just internal validation, but also external validation, which is kind of all the social media, but also the paid media that's feeding back to them, this was a good idea, they're continually being validated, and that will determine where they kind of loop back in to purchase that again or to consider something else. So we have extensive information about it, and I'm sure we'd be happy to share it with you if you're interested in more detail.
We'll have a chance for more questions later. We're actually going to bring, thank you, by the way, Kelly. Please. We're going to bring all of the Kelly and the following speakers together, as you'll notice in the program, together for a panel, and we'll make sure we have chances to ask questions there. I thought this was fascinating. The need states by intent and need states by device, the 3 multi-screening patterns. I wonder how might we apply those patterns to our own business and marketing issues and questions that we have. The munching cow thing bothers me, though. I think from now on I'm going to be standing doing something on my phone, and I'm going to think of myself as a munching cow. I know that's going to be embedded for a while. David and I were a little disappointed too, though, Kelly. We thought the 5 archetypes walk into a bar. There was a joke coming there, and it never came. So you need to work on that one. But thank you very much.